This video is created for storytelling while the real names, locations, and identifying information have been changed to protect the privacy and dignity of the individuals and families involved. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome back to the channel. If you're here late at night looking for a story to drift off to, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Just before dawn on a cold February morning, dispatchers in the small city of North Harbor, Michigan, received a 911 call that would leave even seasoned operators unsettled. The woman on the line did not sound hysterical. She did not scream. She did not beg for an ambulance. Instead, in a flat, distant tone, she said something that made the dispatcher pause. "I need officers here," she said. "He won't stop breathing." There was confusion on the line. The dispatcher clarified. Did she mean he wasn't breathing? "No," the woman replied. "He won't stop." Patrol cars were sent immediately to Harbor Ridge Apartments, a quiet residential complex on East Leyland Street. It was the kind of place built for normal life. Beige siding, assigned parking spaces, balconies with plastic chairs and potted plants, a community pool closed for the winter. On the surface, nothing about it suggested violence. Inside one of those second-floor units, officers found a scene that contradicted the calm exterior. An 18-year-old man lay unresponsive in the living room. There were clear signs of a violent struggle. A kitchen knife was recovered nearby. The woman who had made the call, identified as 44-year-old Melissa Grant, stood only a few feet away when officers entered. According to police reports, she did not attempt to flee, but she did not fully comply at first either. Officers later stated that she moved toward them while still holding the knife, forcing them to use a taser to gain control of the situation. She was taken into custody without further incident. The young man was pronounced dead at the scene. Within hours, news crews lined the entrance to Harbor Ridge Apartments. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones. "I never would have guessed," one resident said. "They kept to themselves." Another described Melissa as protective of her son, maybe too protective, she added carefully. From the outside, Melissa Grant and her son, Ethan Grant, appeared to live an ordinary life. Ethan had just turned 18 the day before. Friends described him as intelligent, introverted, and deeply interested in astronomy and engineering. He spent hours reading about space exploration and watching documentaries about distant galaxies. He talked about college. He talked about leaving North Harbor one day and working somewhere that designed satellites or rocket components. Melissa, by contrast, had built her entire world around him. She had raised Ethan largely on her own. Ethan's father had moved out of state years earlier, and contact was limited. Melissa worked part-time administrative jobs, sometimes from home. Those who knew her said she was devoted to her son, attentive, involved in every aspect of his life. But devotion can blur into dependence. Several former classmates later told reporters that Ethan had mentioned wanting more independence as he approached adulthood. He talked about dorm life, about moving out, about finally having space. There were no public signs of severe distress, no social media posts hinting at despair, no documented history of violent behavior. Yet something shifted in the weeks leading up to his birthday. According to preliminary statements released by law enforcement, Melissa told investigators that Ethan was afraid to turn 18. She claimed he was overwhelmed with the responsibilities of adulthood and didn't want to step into the real world. Investigators have not confirmed whether there is evidence supporting that claim. What is confirmed is this. On the day before his birthday, both had reportedly ingested a significant amount of prescription medication in what police described as an apparent joint attempt to end their lives. Toxicology results are still pending. Ethan lost consciousness. Melissa survived. What happened next is at the center of the criminal investigation. Police allege that after the overdose did not result in death, Melissa used a knife to fatally wound her son while he was unconscious. Authorities believe the injuries indicate he may have regained partial awareness and attempted to defend himself. Melissa has been charged with open murder, meaning the prosecution has not yet specified the degree. A jury will ultimately determine whether the evidence supports first-degree murder, which requires premeditation, or a lesser charge such as second-degree murder. She also faces a charge of resisting and obstructing an officer, stemming from her actions when police arrived. At her initial court appearance, Melissa appeared emotionally unstable. She wept openly, at times struggling to answer the judge's questions. When asked if she understood the charges against her, she nodded through tears. The judge denied bond. The courtroom atmosphere was tense. A few family members were present. As Melissa was led out in handcuffs, voices from the gallery called out, "We love you." That detail struck many observers as unsettling. Public reaction has been divided between disbelief, anger, and attempts to understand how something like this could happen inside a seemingly ordinary home. Experts who study family dynamics point to a concept known as enmeshment, where boundaries between parent and child become blurred. In extreme cases, identity and autonomy are compromised. Independence can feel like abandonment. Growth can feel like loss. There is no official psychiatric diagnosis released in this case, no public confirmation of mental illness, but investigators have indicated that Melissa will likely undergo a psychiatric evaluation as the case proceeds. The financial angle has also been raised. Detectives are reviewing whether there were life insurance policies or other monetary pressures. So far, authorities have not confirmed any evidence suggesting financial motive. Without a clear motive, speculation fills the vacuum. Was this a distorted act of control, a breakdown fueled by fear of being alone, a severe mental health crisis that spiraled beyond reason, or something investigators are yet to uncover? What makes the case especially disturbing is not just the violence, but the calmness of the initial 911 call. Dispatch audio reveals no frantic urgency, no desperate plea for rescue, just a chilling statement repeated twice: "He won't stop breathing." The phrasing alone has become a focal point for analysts following the case. Language often reveals intent. It can expose mindset. It can betray expectation. If someone cannot get another to stop breathing, it suggests action, effort, repetition. That implication now sits at the center of a courtroom battle that will likely unfold over months. Meanwhile, friends of Ethan have begun organizing memorial efforts. A small vigil was held outside Harbor Ridge Apartments, where candles flickered against the cold night air. Several classmates spoke about his love of space, recalling how he once said he wanted his ashes scattered among the stars if he ever died. His family is reportedly exploring ways to honor that wish symbolically. As the legal process moves forward, one reality remains unchanged. An 18-year-old man with plans, interests, and an entire adult life ahead of him is gone. And a mother who once described him as her entire world now sits in a county jail awaiting trial for his death. The answers, whatever they are, will come slowly. For now, North Harbor is left with the same question echoing through every conversation. How does a home become a crime scene overnight? In the days following Melissa Grant's arrest, investigators began the slow process that follows every violent death. Forensic technicians photographed every inch of the apartment. They collected bedding, clothing, medication bottles, electronic devices, and the kitchen knife recovered at the scene. Nothing was considered insignificant. Early autopsy findings provided the first layer of clarity. The medical examiner confirmed that Ethan Grant's cause of death was multiple sharp force injuries. Toxicology showed the presence of prescription sedatives in his system, but not at levels that would have been immediately fatal for a healthy 18-year-old male. That detail shifted the direction of the investigation. If the overdose alone would not have caused death, then the stabbing became the decisive act. Investigators also noted defensive wounds on Ethan's hands and forearms. In court, the prosecutor emphasized this point. Those injuries suggested he may have regained consciousness or partial awareness during the attack. It contradicted any assumption that he died peacefully while unconscious. The prosecution's theory began to take shape. According to charging documents, after both mother and son ingested medication, Melissa regained clarity first. Detectives believe she realized Ethan was still breathing and made a conscious decision to ensure he would not survive. Phone data reportedly shows that between the time of ingestion and the 911 call, there was a gap of more than an hour. An hour can feel like a lifetime in a crisis. It can also provide time for reflection. Melissa's defense attorney countered that timeline immediately. He argued that Melissa was heavily impaired, emotionally unstable, and not thinking rationally. He suggested that what occurred was not calculated murder, but the catastrophic result of a shared mental health breakdown. That distinction will matter immensely at trial. Under Michigan law, first-degree murder requires proof of premeditation and deliberation. The prosecution must show that Melissa had time to think about her actions and chose to proceed anyway. It does not require days of planning. Even minutes can satisfy the legal threshold if intent can be demonstrated. Second-degree murder, by contrast, involves intent to kill but without proven premeditation. The open murder charge allows jurors to weigh both possibilities. Meanwhile, digital forensics added another dimension to the case. Investigators recovered text messages exchanged between Ethan and a close friend just days before his death. In those messages, Ethan spoke about feeling pressure at home. He wrote that his mother had been acting strange about his upcoming birthday. He mentioned arguments about college applications and living arrangements. There were no messages indicating suicidal intent. That detail further complicates the defense's claim of a mutual suicide pact. Prosecutors also revealed that Melissa had searched online for phrases related to what happens when someone turns 18 and leaves home and parent alone after child moves out. While those searches are not criminal, they may help establish state of mind. Court hearings have drawn increasing public attention. Legal analysts note that jurors often struggle with cases involving parent-child homicide. The emotional weight is heavy. It defies instinct. Society is built on the expectation that parents protect their children, not harm them. Psychological experts consulted by media outlets have discussed a phenomenon sometimes referred to as altruistic filicide, where a parent believes killing a child spares them from suffering. However, professionals caution against applying labels prematurely. Each case depends on specific facts and verified mental health evaluations. So far, no official diagnosis has been entered into the court record. Melissa underwent a court-ordered psychiatric evaluation to determine competency. The evaluation concluded she understands the charges and is capable of assisting in her defense. That finding means the trial will proceed. The courtroom dynamic has grown more intense with each hearing. At a preliminary examination, the lead detective testified about the condition of the apartment. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of an outside intruder. The scene indicated a contained internal event. When asked about Melissa's demeanor, the detective described her as calm but disconnected during initial questioning. Body camera footage reportedly shows her asking officers if Ethan was finally still. That phrase, like the 911 call, may become a central element of the prosecution's narrative. Outside the courthouse, public reaction remains divided. Some community members argue that mental illness must be considered with compassion. Others insist that whatever emotional distress existed does not erase accountability. Ethan's friends have continued holding small gatherings in his memory. One vigil included a telescope pointed toward the night sky, a symbolic gesture, a nod to the future he once imagined. His former physics teacher spoke briefly at one gathering, describing Ethan as curious in the best way. She recalled how he stayed after class to ask about black holes and orbital mechanics. She said he was ready for the world, he just needed the chance. That sentence lingers. As the prosecution prepares its case, they are assembling expert witnesses in forensic pathology and behavioral analysis. The defense is expected to call its own mental health professionals to testify about Melissa's psychological state leading up to the incident. Legal strategy will likely hinge on intent. Did Melissa act with calculated purpose after realizing the overdose failed? Or was she operating in a dissociated, impaired state where rational judgment had collapsed? Jurors will be asked to examine timelines, language, wounds, toxicology levels, and digital footprints. They will be asked to interpret not just what happened, but why. The apartment at Harbor Ridge has since been vacated. A small notice from property management states the unit is unavailable pending renovation. Life in the complex has largely returned to routine. Cars come and go, packages are delivered. The pool will reopen in summer. But for residents who heard the sirens that morning, normalcy feels thinner. A single 911 call fractured the illusion of safety that surrounds many quiet neighborhoods. As of now, a trial date is expected later this year. If convicted of first-degree murder, Melissa Grant could face life imprisonment without parole. If the charge is reduced or jurors find mitigating factors, sentencing outcomes will differ significantly. Until a verdict is reached, the case remains legally unresolved. Yet one reality is fixed. An 18-year-old who wanted to study the stars will never attend college. He will never leave his hometown. He will never build the life he talked about in text messages with friends. And a courtroom will soon decide whether his death was the product of calculated intent, psychological collapse, or something in between. By the time jury selection began, nearly a year had passed since the morning police arrived at the Harbor Ridge apartment. What had once been a local shock had matured into a case dissected by legal commentators, mental health professionals, and true crime observers across the state. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was restrained but heavy. 12 jurors and 2 alternates were chosen after careful questioning. Each was asked whether they could remain impartial in a case involving a parent accused of killing her adult son. Several potential jurors admitted they could not. They were dismissed. When opening statements began, the prosecution moved first. The prosecutor stood before the jury and outlined a clear narrative. This was not an accident, not a tragic misunderstanding, not a chaotic moment without awareness. It was a decision. According to the state, Melissa Grant realized the overdose had not ended Ethan's life and chose to act decisively. She pointed to the timeline. Phone records showed activity on Melissa's device well after the ingestion of pills. The prosecution argued that this gap demonstrated consciousness and awareness. They described the hour between ingestion and the fatal stabbing as a window for reflection. Reflection, they argued, implies choice. The defense took a different approach. Melissa's attorney did not deny that she caused Ethan's death. Instead, he focused on state of mind. He described months of emotional deterioration, escalating anxiety, and what he called pathological fear of abandonment. He suggested that Melissa's identity had become entirely dependent on her son's presence. When Ethan prepared to leave home, that fragile identity collapsed. The defense framed the event as a catastrophic psychological break rather than calculated murder. Witness testimony unfolded over the next 2 weeks. The medical examiner reiterated that the sedatives found in Ethan's system were significant but not lethal at the measured concentration. She testified that the stab wounds were the definitive cause of death. On cross-examination, she acknowledged that toxicology levels could impair judgment and perception. The prosecution called the lead detective. Body camera footage was shown to the jury. The courtroom remained silent as Melissa's voice played through the speakers. Calm, almost distant. When she asked officers if Ethan was finally still, several jurors avoided eye contact. The prosecutor paused the video and asked the detective what that phrase suggested to him. He replied carefully. It suggested awareness that he had not been still before. The defense objected to speculation. The judge instructed the jury to rely on their own interpretation. Digital evidence followed. Text messages between Ethan and his friend were displayed on a screen. Jurors read his words about feeling pressured, about arguments at home, about wanting independence. There was no mention of suicidal thoughts. That absence became a quiet but powerful element of the prosecution's case. The defense countered with expert testimony from a clinical psychologist. The psychologist described enmeshed family systems where boundaries between parent and child dissolve. She testified that in extreme cases, a parent may experience the child's independence as a form of existential threat. She stopped short of diagnosing Melissa publicly, but described behaviors consistent with severe emotional dependency. On cross-examination, the prosecutor pressed her. Dependency does not eliminate the ability to distinguish right from wrong, does it? The psychologist conceded that it does not automatically do so. Melissa herself chose to testify. Her voice trembled at first, but she maintained composure. She described fear of being alone, fear that Ethan would disappear from her life once he left. She claimed they had discussed not wanting to be apart. She insisted she believed he wanted the overdose. When asked directly whether she understood that stabbing him would end his life, she hesitated. "Yes," she said quietly, "but I wasn't thinking clearly. I wasn't thinking at all." The prosecution's cross-examination was measured. They asked about the hour gap, about the Google searches, about the defensive wounds. They asked why Ethan had injuries on his hands if he was peacefully unconscious. Melissa struggled to answer. Closing arguments crystallized the case. The prosecution returned to intent. They emphasized that premeditation does not require long-term planning. It requires enough time to form a conscious decision. Minutes can be sufficient. An hour, they argued, is more than sufficient. They reminded jurors that Ethan had plans, text messages, college ambitions. They argued there was no evidence of a mutual pact, only evidence of one person acting decisively. The defense urged compassion without abandoning logic. They asked jurors to consider whether a deeply impaired mind can truly deliberate. They suggested that Melissa's actions were the product of a psychological collapse, not cold calculation. After closing arguments, the jury received instructions from the judge. They were told they could consider first-degree murder, second-degree murder, or acquittal if reasonable doubt existed. Deliberations lasted 3 days. Outside the courthouse, media crews waited. Ethan's friends gathered quietly on the courthouse lawn. Melissa's relatives avoided cameras. On the third afternoon, the jury returned. The courtroom stood as the verdict was read. On the charge of first-degree premeditated murder, not guilty. A faint breath seemed to pass through the room. On the charge of second-degree murder, guilty. Melissa Grant lowered her head. There was no visible outburst, no dramatic collapse, only a slow exhale. Second-degree murder carries severe penalties, but does not require proof of premeditation. The jury's decision signaled that they believed she intended to kill Ethan, but were not convinced beyond reasonable doubt that the act was pre-planned. Sentencing occurred 6 weeks later. The judge acknowledged the emotional complexity of the case, but emphasized accountability. He stated that mental distress may explain behavior, but does not excuse lethal action. He sentenced Melissa to a lengthy prison term within the statutory range for second-degree murder. In his closing remarks, the judge spoke directly about Ethan. He was an adult with a future. That future was taken. The law must respond to that loss. After sentencing, the courtroom emptied quickly. Ethan's former teacher spoke briefly outside, saying the verdict provided a measure of clarity, if not peace. His friends later announced plans to establish a small scholarship fund in his name for local students pursuing science. Melissa was transported to a state correctional facility that same afternoon. Life moved forward, as it always does. Harbor Ridge Apartments completed renovations on Unit 4B. A new tenant signed a lease months later, unaware of the history attached to the walls. The pool reopened. Summer returned. But for those who followed the case closely, the questions linger. How fragile can identity become when it is built around a single person? Where is the boundary between mental illness and legal responsibility? How does a community reconcile empathy with accountability? There are no easy answers. What remains clear is this: a young man's life ended on the threshold of adulthood. A mother now faces decades behind bars. A jury weighed facts, law, and human complexity and rendered a decision within the structure provided to them. The legal chapter has closed. The human one will take far longer. It was an unusually still evening in Clearwater, Florida. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet streets, when Serena Bellamy pulled into the parking structure of her downtown apartment complex, Clearwater Heights. It was a place she had called home for nearly a year, a modern building with secure gates, surveillance cameras, and controlled access parking. She was a familiar sight to the doormen and neighbors, always polite, always smiling, carrying the air of someone who had her life carefully in order. Serena had spent the past few years building her career as a pediatric nurse, a job that required patience, empathy, and a steady hand. Her work at Clearwater Children's Hospital wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful. To her, it meant saving lives, providing comfort to families, and making a difference in a world that often seemed chaotic and unfair. On top of that, she volunteered at local shelters and organized free health checkups for children in underserved neighborhoods. By all accounts, she was generous, thoughtful, and devoted to her community. That evening, however, would shatter everything she had built. Serena parked her silver sedan on the fourth floor of the parking garage and began walking toward the elevator. Her phone buzzed in her purse. She glanced at it and smiled faintly at the message, "See you soon, can't wait." It was from her boyfriend, Lucas Moreno, a young architect with a promising career and a reputation for meticulous work. They had been dating for 6 months, but their connection felt deeper, more enduring than most of Serena's past relationships. Plans for a weekend getaway to Key West had already been finalized, and talk of moving in together after the trip had even surfaced. It was the kind of happiness that felt solid and permanent. But someone else had been watching, someone who didn't want Serena to have that happiness. Earlier that week, Lucas had received an unnerving text from an unknown number, "You don't deserve her." He dismissed it at first, thinking it was a prank or spam, but a few days later a stranger's car had been spotted lingering outside his office, watching him leave each evening. That's when he realized that someone's obsession had crossed the line from silent jealousy into active surveillance. Lucas didn't know who it was or what they were capable of, but he could feel the danger tightening like a noose. Back in the parking garage, Serena's instincts didn't betray her. She didn't notice the shadow slipping between the parked vehicles, the figure crouched low, moving with unnerving precision. Moments later, a black SUV pulled silently behind her car. The engine made no noise, the lights stayed off, and the figure approached swiftly, a small handgun glinting in the dim overhead lighting. By the time the doorman heard a scream and then a sharp report that echoed through the garage, it was already over. Serena had been shot once, then a second time. The black SUV sped away before anyone could respond, leaving a scene that would soon grip the city in disbelief. The investigation began almost immediately. Clearwater Heights security cameras captured fragments of the attack, but the resolution was low and the perpetrator's face was obscured. Investigators recovered shell casings and traces of gunshot residue, but no immediate suspects. Serena's life seemed unremarkable on the surface, but detectives suspected the killer knew her routine and perhaps even her relationships intimately. Detective Marcus Hall, assigned to the case, was a veteran of Clearwater PD with a reputation for patience and persistence. He reviewed the surveillance footage over and over. The black SUV arrived at 7:38 p.m., just minutes before Serena entered the garage. A man stepped out, crouched near her car, and waited. Then a woman appeared behind the wheel, maneuvering the vehicle with steady hands as if she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. "Look at this," Hall said to his partner, Detective Jamie Liu. "This wasn't spontaneous, it was planned. They knew exactly when she would be here." Their investigation led them to Serena's social circle. Friends and coworkers described her as meticulous, devoted, and careful in all aspects of life. There were no known threats, no enemies, nothing to suggest someone would go to this extreme. That made the case all the more baffling. Weeks later, the breakthrough came unexpectedly. A man named Eduardo Torres contacted the police after seeing an appeal for information. He had lent his black SUV to two women earlier that week, he explained, unaware of what they intended. Initially hesitant, he eventually revealed that one of the women, a co-worker of Serena's named Marissa Vale, had pressured him into allowing her to use the vehicle. According to Eduardo, Marissa claimed she needed it for a quick errand, and he, wanting to be helpful, agreed. When detectives brought Marissa in for questioning, she appeared calm, almost too composed. She initially denied knowing anything about the murder. She had borrowed the SUV, she said, but had simply returned it. When pressed, she implicated another woman, Claudia Vega, claiming Claudia had convinced her to assist. The story shifted rapidly under the weight of mounting evidence. Claudia, once brought in for questioning, tried the same tactic. She claimed coercion, saying she had been threatened, forced to drive the vehicle by Marissa and a mysterious third party. But the inconsistencies in her statements, combined with surveillance footage, quickly made it clear that the plot had been meticulously orchestrated. According to Claudia, the real mastermind was Marissa Vale. Consumed by jealousy, Marissa had fixated on Serena. She believed that Lucas should be with her, not Serena. Her obsession had grown over weeks, if not months. Marissa had been monitoring Serena's work schedule, her appointments, even her dinner plans. She had recruited Claudia, promising money, a ride to freedom, and protection in exchange for participating in the act. It was a web of manipulation, deceit, and moral corruption that spiraled into violence. Detectives pieced together a chilling timeline. On the day of the murder, Marissa had coordinated with Claudia and Eduardo, ensuring every step of the plan was executed flawlessly. Surveillance footage confirmed the SUV's movement, witnesses confirmed Claudia's presence at key locations, and financial records revealed cash withdrawals consistent with the bribe Claudia claimed to have received. Even with these pieces in place, the human toll was staggering. Lucas, who had returned home that night after work, was met with police and the grim news that Serena had been murdered. The grief was immediate, raw, and suffocating. He reached out to friends for support, trying to understand how someone could orchestrate such an attack. The betrayal, the jealousy, and the sheer planning behind it left him reeling. And so Clearwater was left grappling with a stark reality. Someone had taken a life not out of necessity, not in self-defense, not in the heat of a moment, but out of envy, obsession, and the need to control another person's destiny.
Detective Hall knew one thing for certain: the investigation was only just beginning. They had the suspects, they had the evidence, but the courtroom battle, the psychological unraveling, and the questions of motive and accountability were still ahead. And as for the city of Clearwater, it would be a long time before the echoes of that quiet Wednesday evening faded from memory.
The morning after Serena Bellamy's murder, Clearwater was buzzing with unease. News crews lined the streets near Clearwater Heights, their cameras focused on the secure parking garage where the crime had occurred. Residents whispered behind drawn curtains, uneasy in a city that suddenly felt unsafe. Inside the police department, Detective Marcus Hall and his team were working tirelessly, connecting threads, reviewing surveillance, and trying to understand the minds of those responsible. Forensic analysis had confirmed everything the surveillance footage had suggested. The SUV had been at the scene long before Serena arrived. The trajectory of the bullets, the placement of shell casings, and gunshot residue on Serena's hands all indicated that this was not a robbery gone wrong. It was methodical, executed with the precision of someone who had thought through every detail, every variable. Detective Hall convened a meeting with his team to go over the suspects. Claudia Vega's confession had broken the case open, but it raised more questions than it answered. Claudia admitted to driving the SUV to Clearwater Heights and staying out of sight while the actual shooter, Christopher Lane, executed the attack. But she insisted she had been manipulated, coerced by Marissa Vale. Financial records showed a $500 withdrawal from Marissa's account days before the murder, allegedly to pay for expenses related to the plan. And text messages between the two women revealed a growing obsession. Marissa's envy of Serena had become all-consuming. "The deeper we dig, the worse this looks," Hall said. "This wasn't spontaneous. This was calculated. Months of planning, and someone had to be pulling the strings." Christopher Lane, a 31-year-old with a minor criminal record, had agreed to carry out the shooting in exchange for money, drugs, and promises of connections with local gangs. He had initially denied involvement when questioned, but cracked once confronted with surveillance and Claudia's testimony. His account was chillingly precise. He remembered the rehearsals, the drop-off points, the exact wording Marissa used to ensure compliance. "She told me it was simple," Christopher said in his confession. "Just get in, do what you have to do, and leave. I'd be paid, and no one would know my name." Meanwhile, Lucas Moreno was struggling to make sense of it all. He spent the days after Serena's murder meeting with friends and family, trying to cope with the void left in his life. He was haunted by the knowledge that someone had watched them, planned meticulously, and decided that Serena's life was expendable. He remembered every laugh, every late-night phone call, every dream they had discussed, all gone in an instant. The investigation soon revealed the hierarchy of the conspiracy. Marissa Vale, a former co-worker of Lucas's, had been obsessed with him ever since their brief relationship years earlier. Despite being cordial and polite in public, privately, Marissa's fixation had grown toxic. She could not bear the thought of Lucas with Serena, and convinced herself that removing Serena from the equation would allow her to reclaim what she believed was rightfully hers. Evidence suggested Marissa had attempted to involve multiple people. She approached friends and acquaintances, suggesting violence, coercion, and even lethal schemes. All of them had refused, except Claudia. Claudia's loyalty and desperation had made her pliable, her judgment clouded by the promise of financial aid and protection. It was an illustration of how obsession could manipulate even the morally conflicted. The courtroom battle began weeks later, with prosecutors laying out the horrific sequence of events to the jury. Photographs from the parking garage, surveillance footage, bank statements, and text messages painted a damning picture. Christopher Lane, having agreed to testify against Marissa in exchange for a reduced sentence, recounted the day of the murder in painstaking detail. His testimony left the courtroom tense and silent.
Every word he spoke highlighted the premeditation, the cold-blooded nature of the crime, and the level of manipulation involved. Marissa's defense tried to argue coercion, claiming that she had been influenced by outside pressures. They painted her as a troubled young woman who had made a series of poor decisions, but the jury was unimpressed. The evidence was too clear, too extensive. The planning, the execution, and the steps taken to cover up the crime made a convincing argument that this was deliberate, not impulsive. Claudia, despite her cooperation with authorities, was not spared. Her decision to participate, even under manipulation, placed her firmly within the realm of criminal liability. Prosecutors emphasized that she had willingly driven the SUV, had knowledge of the plan, and had helped set the stage for the shooting. In her statements, she admitted fear and desperation had guided her choices, but the law made little distinction when a life had been taken. Outside the courtroom, Clearwater mourned. Serena's co-workers at the hospital established a memorial fund in her name, aiming to continue her mission of providing care for children in need. Donations poured in from across the country, highlighting the impact one life, however brief, could have on a community. Lucas, though devastated, focused his grief into advocacy, speaking publicly about the dangers of obsession, manipulation, and the consequences of unchecked envy. He became a quiet voice, urging others to recognize warning signs before tragedy struck. The final pieces of the legal puzzle fell into place when forensic evidence directly tied Marissa to the crime. Fingerprints found on the SUV, cell phone GPS data confirming her presence at key locations, and financial withdrawals aligned perfectly with the conspiracy. The prosecution's argument was straightforward. Marissa Vale orchestrated the murder out of jealousy, using Claudia as a pawn and Christopher as the executor. Every element of her plan demonstrated premeditation, malice, and deliberate intent to harm. During sentencing, the courtroom was heavy with emotion. Lucas sat in the front row, his hands clenched, listening as the judge recounted the evidence. Claudia, remorseful and resigned, awaited her punishment, knowing that her choices had consequences. Christopher, once brash and defiant, now sat quietly, accepting the verdict in exchange for a reduced sentence and protection from harsher penalties. The judge addressed Marissa directly. "Your actions were deliberate, calculated, and driven by obsession. You stripped away the future of a young woman who had done nothing to deserve this fate. Your lack of remorse and the lengths you went to cover your tracks demonstrate a clear danger to society. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." For many, the verdict was justice served, but for Lucas and those who loved Serena, no sentence could undo the loss. The family, friends, and co-workers who survived her death had to navigate life without her. Her absence created a void that words and memorials could only partially fill. Yet, amidst the grief, there were glimmers of hope. Lucas continued his advocacy work, focusing on helping those who had been manipulated or controlled by toxic relationships. He worked with community organizations, schools, and law enforcement to educate people on warning signs, hoping to prevent tragedies similar to Serena's. The hospital established a scholarship in her name for nursing students pursuing work in pediatric care, ensuring that her legacy lived on in ways that honored her compassion and dedication. Crystal clear evidence, confessions, and relentless police work had solved the case, but the psychological ripples remained. The story of obsession, manipulation, and jealousy reminded everyone that danger could come from those closest to us, or those we thought we could trust. Detective Hall reflected on the investigation for weeks afterwards, writing detailed notes, debriefing his team, and sharing insights with colleagues across the state. He knew the Clearwater case would be studied for years, not just for the crime itself, but for the layers of human behavior that allowed it to happen. By the time the trial concluded, the narrative of betrayal, envy, and tragedy cemented itself in the public consciousness. News outlets covered the sentencing extensively, while online forums debated motives, conspiracies, and the terrifying depths of human obsession. Clearwater, once a quiet coastal city, would never forget the Wednesday evening that changed everything, the life stolen, and the web of manipulation that led to it.
The courtroom was tense the morning Marissa Vale finally faced judgment. After months of investigation, confessions, and testimony, everything had led to this moment. Detective Marcus Hall and his team sat quietly at the back, observing as the prosecution laid out the meticulous case against her. Every piece of evidence, from surveillance footage to bank withdrawals, text messages, and eyewitness accounts, was displayed for the jury. The story of obsession, manipulation, and a life senselessly taken unfolded in stark detail. Marissa entered the courtroom flanked by her public defenders, her expression carefully neutral. The media cameras clicked, capturing every subtle gesture. From the outside, she appeared composed, but the prosecution's narrative painted a picture of a woman who had orchestrated a murder out of jealousy. They detailed how Marissa had monitored Lucas Moreno's relationship with Serena Bellamy, manipulated Claudia Vega into participating, and recruited Christopher Lane as the shooter. The evidence left no doubt this was premeditated, cold, and deliberate. Christopher Lane took the stand first. He described the plan in chilling detail, the rehearsals, the surveillance, and the execution. "She made it all sound normal," he said, voice low but steady. "I thought it was just a simple robbery. I didn't know she intended for her to be killed until it happened." His testimony reinforced the calculated nature of the crime and highlighted the degree of influence Marissa had over those she manipulated. Claudia Vega's testimony followed. Her voice shook as she admitted her role in driving the SUV, remaining hidden while the murder took place. She expressed remorse and acknowledged how Marissa's manipulation had clouded her judgment. She explained the initial fear, the promises of money, and the belief that helping Marissa would protect her and her young son. While the jury sympathized with her, they also understood that her complicity had contributed to Serena's death. The prosecution emphasized that Claudia's fear and loyalty did not absolve her, but that cooperation with law enforcement helped piece together the full story. Claudia would ultimately receive a 35-year sentence as part of her plea deal, a sentence designed to reflect her participation while taking into account her cooperation and willingness to testify. Marissa's defense tried a different strategy. They painted her as a troubled woman, suggesting she had been influenced by external pressures and circumstances. They highlighted her personal struggles, her own failed relationships, and argued that she had not intended for anyone to die. They attempted to frame Claudia and Christopher as the true executors, hoping to lessen Marissa's culpability. But the jury was unconvinced. Surveillance footage clearly showed Marissa's involvement in planning and coordinating the attack. Financial transactions traced her actions leading up to the murder. Text messages revealed obsession and an intent to harm. Every attempt to portray her as a passive participant crumbled under the weight of the evidence. The most shocking part of the trial came when the court replayed the video of the SUV entering the garage and the shooter following Serena. The jury watched as the crime unfolded, clear and unambiguous. The images were stark, brutal, and haunting, underscoring the premeditation that had defined the act. Even with the defense's arguments, the visual evidence and the testimony of Christopher and Claudia left little room for doubt. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with the verdict. "Guilty on all counts," the foreperson announced, their voice steady. The courtroom reacted with a mixture of relief, grief, and disbelief. Justice had been served, but at an immeasurable cost. Serena's life could not be restored, and the community remained scarred by the magnitude of the crime. The sentencing phase followed shortly after. The judge, presiding over one of the most high-profile cases in Clearwater's history, addressed Marissa directly. Your actions were calculated and deliberate. You manipulated others, plotted, and executed a plan that took an innocent life. Your lack of remorse and the lengths you went to cover your tracks demonstrate a serious threat to society. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Christopher Lane, having cooperated with the prosecution, received a 25-year sentence. His willingness to testify against Marissa ensured that he would not face life imprisonment, but the gravity of his actions still carried consequences. Claudia Vega, meanwhile, began serving her 35-year term, a constant reminder of how fear, desperation, and manipulation could lead to irreparable choices. Outside the courtroom, Clearwater mourned Serena's death, but also found ways to honor her memory. Her co-workers at Smile Care Foundation established a scholarship in her name, supporting young dental students pursuing careers in pediatric care. Donations and memorial contributions poured in, reflecting the impact Serena had made in her brief life. Lucas Marino, although devastated, channeled his grief into advocacy, raising awareness about the dangers of obsessive behavior and domestic conspiracies. He spoke at schools, community events, and local organizations, warning others about the signs of toxic behavior and the importance of seeking help before tragedy struck. For the community, the trial was a lesson in vigilance. It underscored the reality that danger could come from the people we least expect. Marissa's obsessive envy, Claudia's fear-driven loyalty, and Christopher's willingness to commit murder combined into a perfect storm that destroyed a promising life. The Clearwater Heights apartment complex, once a quiet and secure neighborhood, became a symbol of the thin line between normalcy and catastrophe. Despite the verdict, Lucas struggled with the void left by Serena's absence. He visited her memorial site regularly, leaving flowers and speaking to her picture, recounting memories of their time together. He reminded himself that although he could not bring her back, he could continue her legacy by helping others and preserving the memory of her compassion, kindness, and commitment to her community. Psychologists and criminologists studying the case later pointed to the dangers of obsessive behavior and the manipulative dynamics that can escalate quickly into violence. Marissa Vale's actions were a stark example of how unaddressed jealousy, fixation, and a refusal to accept reality could lead to unimaginable consequences. The case became part of training programs for law enforcement and social services, ensuring that future situations could be identified and mitigated before they reached a deadly stage. Even in the aftermath of tragedy, Clearwater found a measure of closure. Justice had been delivered, but the human cost remained. The city mourned Serena, supported Lucas, and took steps to educate the community. Memorials, scholarships, and awareness campaigns ensured that her legacy would continue. Her life, though cut short, became a catalyst for change and understanding in a city that would never forget the cost of envy turned deadly.